Again, welcome to Miami Church. If I don't know you, my name is Greg, and I'm one of the pastors here. And it's great to see you this morning. Now, you're coming in. We're on week 2 of a conversation around the idea of faith. And you can see here on the screen that we're calling it starting point. And we said last week it's kind of a simple concept that everything has a starting point, right? You have a starting point. Your career had a starting point, your education had a starting point, your addictions have a starting point, your habits have a starting point. Everything has a starting point, and the thing that we don't really think about a lot is this idea, you'll see here, that faith has a starting point as well. The idea of faith, and your faith, right, whatever it is, however you would define it, whatever you embrace, it has a starting point. At some point along the way, right, somewhere in your history, your faith began. And now we talked about this a little bit last week. For most of us, for many, not all of us, but for most of us, this starting point for faith was some point in our childhood, right? Some point when we were a kid, and there was some parent or priest or pastor or someone who influenced that along the way. And so as kids, we were given or we were handed a framework for faith. And we were handed these framework ideas that we latched onto. Things like God is good and God answers prayer. And God rewards good people and God punishes bad people. And if you want to be good, do these things. If you want to be bad, do these things. And we were given this framework of faith. Now, some of you maybe didn't grow up in a church background, and somewhere along the way, you just kind of put it together on your own, right? Through different people and influences, you kind of put together and kind of piece together, like, this is what I believe and this is what I don't believe. But something happens, and this happens to all of us at various levels, to various degrees. Something happens to all of us is that we get older and we become adults, or in some of your cases, you're adulting. And you're working on it, right? And suddenly, that's funny, right? I see you on the front. Suddenly, without meaning to, right? Well, not intentionally, there seems to be this gap or this space between what was given to us as this framework of faith and what we are experiencing in reality, what we are going through in our life. There's this young couple that here in the city, and they're in their 20s, and my wife and I have just really tried to invest some time in them. And they're just really a cool young couple. And he grew up kind of more in a non-denominational Christian kind of thing, kind of like what's going on here. And she grew up very Catholic. And their life has just been hard. I mean, it's just stuff. I mean, just stuff. And some of it's their own fault because they make some stupid decisions. And some of it's just life, right? And what's happened to them is as they're facing these real challenges and real struggles, their childhood framework, right, this framework that they had, and their frameworks are different, but the frameworks that they have, they've just melted. They've just kind of melted under the rigors and the realities of life, of their adult reality. And I'm watching them, right, as kind of from the outside looking on, right, and trying to help. And they just remind me of a kite. They're just kind of like just bouncing around. It's like if you took a racquetball and just started bouncing it all over the walls, and their faith is just floating all over the place, and they're trying to decide what's real and what's not real, and they're on this journey. And the reality is because all of us face something like that, right? We all face doubts and questions, and so we decided as a church that we were going to take some weeks, and we were going to take some time to have this conversation called Starting Point, and that we were going to push this conversation about faith. And we were just going to own, hey, we got questions, we've got doubts, there's things that we just don't know, and life is hard, and these things are really important, and so we're just going to push toward this conversation about faith, and we're going to explore, what does it really mean to believe in God? I mean, who is this Jesus guy? Like, what is really real and what's not real? And what if we just all kind of hit the restart button? Like, what if we all just said, okay, hey, let's just rethink everything. What is the real point of this? And what I'm most excited about, one of the things that's the funnest part of me already just in this first week that we've been in, is not only are we having these conversations on Sundays, which is great, and we have these neighborhood teams that meet throughout the week, which are teams of people who gather together for community and to engage God's Word and to serve our city, and we're sharing stories there. There's stories that are happening over coffee and lunch throughout the city. And we want to encourage more of that. And we've also had several who have just told their story via video. and they're willing to say, hey, I'll share my story. I'll share my starting point. So I want you to take a look at the screens, and here is Lester sharing his starting point.
As a child, my starting point was being raised in a Seventh-day Adventist and going on my own until 16. But that at 16, really studying the Bible, that was my starting point. And first, establishing a relationship with God. And then I became a wild child, exposed to unsupervised lifestyle starting at 16. After living my 20s to my early 30s in a life of vices, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, womanizing, and just doing these things that a toxic masculinity image that was brought on me by my father won over my personality after he passed away at 24.
So when my dad died of prostate cancer, that's when I lost my faith. And because I was raised in the church, I was raised studying the Bible, and I became a bitter man. And I used my knowledge of the Bible to make fun of people who believed in God. And I really started looking internally, trying to understand why I had gotten off track so badly. I started reading books. I love to read, so I started reading all the books. I started all the books, but not the right one. And I started exercising. I started eating better. I started pushing myself away from vices and from friendships that were bringing me constantly back into that toxic lifestyle. And I changed. Oh my God, but when I look back at who I was and what I've done, the shame, the guilt, that by far is the most painful part. And it was liberating to talk it out with God and ask Him for forgiveness. And that load was taken off of my back. Along that path, I felt something was missing. I couldn't put my finger on it until I came to church. And that was the start for me. Coming to Miami Church was the friendship that I built there with these strangers who seemed to genuinely care for me. And that my struggle, didn't scare them. Instead, they're like, you can do it, just keep coming. And even though I would slide back, and sometimes I would stumble and I would fall, and I would go back dabble into bad life choices, they were still there. They're like, oh, it's okay. Come back to church. And so that friendship, that openness, that love is how I understood it. Love from strangers, and I was missing that. It has made all the difference for me in my life. Coming to Miami Church and being part of that. My name is Lester, and this is my starting point.
Pretty cool, huh? There's something powerful about the story, right? We all have a story, and all of our stories are different, and our backgrounds are different. But there's something powerful, and so this is what we're encouraging in this conversation: is for us to share our stories. One of the things that people say to me when I ask their story, I usually get one of two responses, right? One of the responses is like, yeah, it's boring, you don't want to hear it. Or like, no, I don't really have a starting point. I'm like, what? That's perfect. What we're just looking for is authenticity and conversation, and I've never heard a boring story ever in my life. Now, last week, we began this with this idea that the starting point, we made the case, the starting point for the Christian faith is a question. And if you weren't here last week, you can go to miamichurch.com, hit watch, and see what we said. But we said that the starting point for the Christian faith is this question right here: who is Jesus? And that at some point, right, at some point along your life, you're going to have to wrestle to the ground this question, like, who do you think Jesus is? And we're going to continue in the coming weeks to unpack this a little bit more. But I have found that traditionally, especially those of you who grew up in a church background, the starting point was not presented to you in the form of a question, who is Jesus? For me and for many of you who I know, the starting point was actually presented to you as an accusation. And it was this: you're a sinner. You are a sinner. And there was this idea of guilt and shame and judgment and condemnation. And what's really interesting, this word sin, it's a really interesting word. Now, we're looking at this from the English, right? The English word sin. This word, in any religious conversation, at some point is going to surface. It's going to come to the front. And if you've had any kind of background in church, you're going to know this word. Now, this word is an uncomfortable word. Some of you are already squirming just because we brought this up, right? And this is kind of an old school, antiquated word. And it's really only used in the theological sense, right? I've never seen a parent, right? I've never seen a parent look at their kid and go, listen, son, you sinned against me and your mother. There's, right? I've never seen a business owner or a boss say, I'm going to need to meet you in my office because you have sinned against me and our company. Right? I mean, the policeman pulls you over on your way home today on US 1. He's not going to give you a sin citation, right? He's not going to. Right? The only time we use this word, sin, is in relation to God. Now, here's another interesting part about this word, right? This word, it's a heavy word, right? I mean, this is kind of a weighty word. I think it's part of the reason that so many of us resist this word, because if you say, I am a sinner or I have sinned, I mean, it's heavy. I mean, there's not really any wiggle room there, right? There's no like little, well, you know, my dad did this, but when I was younger, I was like, that kind of happened to me. And that, like, when you say, like, sin is like looking in the mirror, looking back at your reflection and saying, hey, there's a problem. And that problem's me. And I've sinned. It's heavy. The problem is me and I have sinned. See, it's not a fun word. Now, there's a problem, though, with this, is because all of us know, right? We know that we're not perfect. We know that we're not perfect, and so there's this tension, right? There's this tension between, hey, we know that we're not perfect, we know we don't get it right every time, but man, I don't know that I want to be categorized as a sinner, because that's like really heavy and deep. And so I believe that culturally we have adopted a new word, kind of a substitute word. A word that kind of makes it a little easier to wiggle around a little bit and opt out. And so we've replaced the word, maybe not intentionally, the word sin with this word, mistake. How many times have you seen on TV, right, a politician or a public leader, they'll stand at a podium, there's like 8 microphones up here, and what do they say? I have made a terrible mistake, right? I have made a terrible mistake, and I've hurt my family. I blew up my reputation. I've hurt the city. I've made a terrible mistake, right? And what do? You watch this, right? You're watching it on TV, and what do you think? A mistake. A mistake is something you make on a math test, right? So you erase it. Right? A mistake is you're driving, and Google says turn right, and you turn left, right? That's a mistake. Like, mistake. You made a 4-year mistake. You just got caught. That's what you did, right? A mistake. But there's something about this. Like if I were to come up here, right, and don't raise your hand or don't elbow anybody, but if I were to come up here just with no context and go, hey, how many of you in here have made mistakes in your past? Just kind of raise your hand if you've made mistakes in your past, right? You don't raise your hand. But you would, right? You would raise your hand, because if you didn't raise your hand, right, you'd be like, what's wrong with you, right? Like, are you perfect? Like, who do you think you are, right? You made mistakes, right? You would. You would feel compelled to raise your hand. If I came up here, no context, right, and just walked up here, the first thing I said, hey, raise your hand if you have sinned. You know what would happen? Some of you would, because you feel guilty. The nun used to beat you over the head. But you know what happened? Especially this front row right here, they would hesitate a minute, and they would kind of be like, is anybody else participating behind me? Because before I do that, I want to see if other people, right? Mistake, easy. Yeah, of course, I've made mistakes. But sin, it's heavy. So here's the point. I don't think this word, mistake, is the right word. Because mistake involves insufficient knowledge. A mistake is something that you learn from and you don't do it again, right? And here's what I know about you, and here's what I know about me, right? Here's what I know is sometimes we make mistakes on purpose. You ever made a mistake on purpose? If somebody goes on TV and is like, hey man, I'm going to admit to a 6-year mistake. Can you call a 6-year mistake a mistake? What is that? And here's something else I know about us is sometimes we plan our mistakes. What do you call a mistake that you plan? You have a stash of mistakes hidden in your house somewhere. Some of you already planned your next mistake. What do you call that? Is that a premeditated mistake? Is there such a thing as that? You know what happens to me? I think it happens to you too. We make the same mistakes over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? These are repeated mistakes. Like, what do you call a mistake that you make over and over and over and over again? Or worse, what do you call a person who makes the same mistake over and over and over and over again? A mistaker? Like, mistakes just doesn't cut it. There's something else going on. And you know why? I mean, what do you do if you make a mistake? What do? You correct it, right? If I make a mistake, I correct it. I erase it and redo it. Or whoops, I should have made a left. I made a right. I turn around and go back and turn the wrong way. See, but here's the problem. You can't correct you, right? I can't correct me. I'm the problem. Why am I not able to do what I know I should do? And why am I unwilling, or why do I resist the idea of embracing the fact that I have a sin problem? See, I've tried for years. You've tried for years. Your spouse has tried to correct you, right? A friend, a parent. Some of you have paid people to help correct you. I have. I've paid people $125 an hour to try to correct me, right? But there is, some of you have lost friends, you've lost spouses, maybe even jobs because of your propensity to make mistakes. Like, why can't you just quit making the same mistake? Why can't you just quit losing your temper? Why can't you just quit eating so much? Why can't you just stop looking at that? Why can't you quit drinking? Why can't you quit spending so much money? Why can't you just correct yourself? And then Jesus enters into the conversation. And if you know anything about Jesus, I mean, he talks about sin. I mean, this is important, right? When Jesus talked about sin, he did it in the context of relationship. And Jesus said, you know what sin does? It breaks relationships. You know this. It's obvious, right? I mean, what happens, right, to a spouse or to a friend or to a parent or to a colleague, right? What happens when you know it's wrong and you do it anyway? What happens? Right? What happens to the relationship? It's broken. Right? It's broken. And you've hurt people. I've hurt people. And here's what we're saying. And it's why we're saying the starting point for the faith is not sin. The starting point for faith is Jesus. It's not an accusation. It's not you're a sinner. It's a question. We're saying that because of this big idea right here. That Jesus... that his entire purpose for talking about sin is not condemnation, but rather restoration. 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 You know this. Again, this is obvious stuff, right? If the relationship is broken, right? If my wife and I, my relationship is broken because I did something stupid, I made a mistake, right? If it's broken, right? How is it restored? Oh, I'm sorry. That ain't working. Oh, my bad. No? It's only restored if I admit, right, if I own, if I acknowledge, right, that I have offended. I have been the offender. I have offended. I have done something that I probably knew was wrong, and I did it anyway, and I hurt you. And it's not words, I'm sorry, that do it. It's more than that, right? There's this deep sense that I have offended you, and I am owning it. And the only way for a relationship to be restored, right, is for the offender to acknowledge and embrace the fact that there was an offense, right? And here's the point, right? Here's the big idea, right? Jesus is saying, hey, the entire purpose for me talking about this idea of sin is not condemnation, but restoration, because there's a God. And he's a good God and a loving God. In fact, he's your heavenly Father, and he wants you to be restored to him. He wants to be in a relationship with you. He wants to be in an intimate, personal relationship with you, but there's a problem. And the problem's not that you made a mistake. The problem's not that so happened to you. The problem is that you are a sinner, that I am a sinner. And Jesus says, hey, what I'm talking about, guys, if you're really paying attention to what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about not condemnation or guilt or shame or to belittle you. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this because what I am talking about is this idea that you can be restored, that the relationship can be restored. Now, this is really interesting. There's a Bible on your chair. I'd love for you to grab it. It looks like this. And I'd love for you to go to Matthew chapter 5. I want to look at just a couple things really fast. We could spend hours looking at examples of this, but I just want to point out a couple of examples so you can see what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about this idea of sin. And in Matthew chapter 5, that's page 659. 659, bottom right-hand corner of 659. Now, a lot of stuff's going on here. I don't have time to fully give you context. But this is called, like in kind of old school Bible language, it's called the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is teaching these principles. And he's talking to a wide variety of people. But within the group that he's talking about are these people who are very religious and who follow all the rules and all the things. And what they've really done is they've kind of customized the rules around how they want to live. And so they kind of made themselves feel like they're better than they are. And he's talking to some of these people. And he's also talking to other normal people like me and you. And here's how I want to pick up in verse 20. So chapter 5, verse 20, kind of bottom right-hand corner. And this is Jesus talking, because these are his words, right? If you had red letters, these would be in red letters. He says, for I tell you, Jesus is talking, that unless your righteousness, unless you're good, really amazingly perfect and good, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Like these Pharisees and teachers of the law, these are the people who are perfect, right? They've done everything right. Really what they've done is they made the system to fit what they want it to say. He says, so I tell you, unless you can just be perfect and live perfectly and not make any mistakes, he says, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And the people in the audience are hearing this, and you know what they're hearing? Doomed. Well, that's it. I'm screwed. Right? You're doomed. You got no hope. You're done. You're like, oh, thanks, Jesus. This is great. Thanks for the pep talk. Right? Then he keeps going. Look what he says. Verse 21. He says, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder. Don't kill anybody. And anyone who murders will be subject to, flip the page, judgment. Verse 22. But I tell you that anyone who is angry, you ever been angry? Yeah, I was ticked off yesterday. Anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. What? So I don't have to actually kill him? Because I got some restraint. He's saying, no. If you're angry, then you're guilty of murder. What do you call it? And then flip down. Go down a little bit. Skip to 27. This one's great. He keeps going. This is part of the same message. He says, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. Don't commit adultery. Don't sleep with someone that's not your wife or your husband. Right? Don't do that. You know that. Then look what he says. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. What? You guys are all out. Guys, I see you. Don't you acting all like you're done, right? My wife's not here. My youngest son's done. You've committed you know what he's doing here? You know what Jesus is doing? Okay? There's a couple of things he's doing here. Right? One is there's these people who think they've got it all figured out and they think they're all perfect and whatever. They're the people who've defined it as mistakes. Right? Well, I don't make any mistakes. because I wrote the rules where I don't make mistakes. I wrote the rules to fit me. Right? And he's basically going, you guys have no clue. And then what he's also doing here is he's setting the bar. He's like, you guys, that's great. You got all these rules, and there are 600 and whatever number of rules that you follow and whatever. He says, but even with that junk, he says, I'm setting the bar so high. I'm setting the bar to what it means to be with God and to follow. I'm setting it so high that none of you have a chance. You don't have a chance. I mean, if you just get angry with somebody, you're done. We're all done. And they're thinking, we're doomed. We're doomed. And he's setting the bar so high because he wants you to know that, yeah, you are. You're a sinner. You're a sinner. That's it. You're a sinner. You can't, maneuver your way or finagle your way into this relationship. You are a sinner. But then look what he does. I want to show another quick story. Flip over to John chapter 8. It's to the right. John chapter 8. It's page 730. John chapter 8. And many of you know this story. For the sake of time, I don't have time to go deep dive into the story. But many of you know this story, right? There was a woman. You've heard the woman caught in adultery, right? You've heard this story, many of you. There was this woman who was caught in adultery. Not like pretend, but like really caught in the act of adultery, right? And these religious people, right, these same kind of people, they bring her in front of Jesus. And they say, Jesus, here's what happened. By the way, you got to read the Bible. This is incredible stuff, right? So they bring her to Jesus, right? And they say, teacher, here's the deal. We caught this woman in the act of adultery, and the law says that if she's caught in adultery, that she should be killed. That we should take stones. Can you imagine this, right? This was the law. That we should take stones, and we should throw the stones at her and keep pelting her with stones until she dies. What do you say? Here's what he said. I'll show it on the screen. Verse 8, second part, verse 7, second part, he says this. He says, let any of you who is without sin, there's your word, be the first one to throw the stone. Right? And then what happens? They slowly start I wasn't here, right? It says the oldest, right? The oldest, people like me who are smarter than you. I'm out of here. This is a trap, right? He says, let any of you who's without sin throw the first stone, right? And they all slowly back away, and he's doing some stuff where he's writing in the ground, which is really cool. I want to know what all that is. And then look at the next verse. So Jesus, he's talking to her now, right? Can you just imagine? They're like face to face. Right? Jesus straightened up and he asked her, he said, hey, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? There was a bunch of people here now, right? And I guess she kind of looks up and she's like, wow, it's empty. She says, no one, sir. And then look what he says. He says, then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. What's he say? Go now and leave your life of sin. I like that. That's a good English phrase. Leave your life of sin. Right? Now, is she a sinner? Yes. Not your question. Yes. All right. Was she wrong? Had she really disobeyed the law? Yes. Right? But Jesus is saying, you know what? Don't do that anymore. Right? Don't do that anymore. But I'm not here. My goal is not to guilt you and to shame you and to make you feel bad so that you'll do something. No. He's saying, listen, my goal is to restore you to a relationship with God. That's what I want. I want you to be in a relationship with God, a God who loves you so much. Now, don't sin. Don't be stupid. I'm not excusing that, but I'm saying, hey, leave that life. Leave that life. And here's my point. Here's how we wrap this up. When you think about Jesus, I know so many of you are on this journey. When you're considering following Jesus, when you consider this idea of starting point and restarting your faith, when you think sin, when you think I'm a sinner, see, Jesus is saying, hey, that's not a path to condemnation. That's not a path to guilt, to shame, to judgment. He says, sin, the idea of sin is a way back to relationship. Sin is a pathway to relationship because when you recognize, when you own, when you acknowledge, hey, I'm a sinner. I'm messed up. I need help. See, sin paves the way back to God. It paves the way to forgiveness. It paves the way to restoration. And Jesus says, yeah, you gotta embrace the fact. Yeah, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I've set the bar really high, okay? So all of us, if we're honest and true, and we're sinners, you got to embrace the fact, but you embrace that so that you can be everything that I made you to be. So you can live the life that I've called you to live. And one of Jesus' followers, who was actually one of his best friends, who at the end of his life, he reflected back on everything that Jesus had taught and done and said, and he penned these words, which you know, right? These are famous words. He penned these words. And he said this, he said, God so loved the world, right? That he gave his one and only Son, that's Jesus, that whoever believes in him doesn't perish but has eternal life. That's life with God forever. Right? That's the part you learned in when you were a kid. Then the next part, right, that sometimes we stop reading is this, verse 17. For God, what? He did not send his Son, that's Jesus, into the world to what? To condemn the world, but to what? Save the world through him. That's restoration. That's restoration. See, I don't know where you come from or what your background is or what your framework for faith is, but Jesus is saying, you know what? Yeah, sin's a real word. And it's more than a mistake. You didn't just make a mistake. No. If you're honest, if you really look in the mirror, if you really own it, like, yeah, you're a sinner. You can't fix yourself. You've tried. I've tried. You've paid somebody. You can go self-help book. You can do whatever you want to do. But no. But the goal of that, the point of that, is not for you to look in the mirror and see yourself as shameful and guilt and condemnation. The goal of that is because I want to be restored to you. I want to be in a relationship with you. So the big idea, Jesus' entire purpose for talking about sin, it's not condemnation, but rather restoration. Will you pray with me? God, I am so excited about this journey we are on together as a community, as a church. God, there's so many of us that are on a path toward you and back toward you. And our journeys and our stories take us all over the place, as we've seen through Jordan and Lester and Leah and Allegra and all these others who are sharing their stories. But the common thing, God, for every single one of us, regardless of where we come from or where we are on this journey, God, the common thing is you're on a pursuit, a relentless pursuit to restore us to you. And so, God, I pray that whatever you got to do, it's like the song said that we sang a minute ago, that whatever the walls are, the barriers are, whatever we're doing, God, to push you away, God, that you will just break through that even in these moments, God, and that we will experience afresh your love and your grace and your hope and your restoration. And that's my prayer in these moments now, and I pray in the name of Jesus.